The idea of eternal fire has been one of the most powerful tools used in preaching. It is more than just a religious image. It is a psychological weapon. When someone is told that disobedience, doubt, or even natural human mistakes can result in endless torture, it plants fear in the deepest parts of the mind. This fear is not like ordinary fear of danger. It is not the fear of losing a job, failing an exam, or getting sick. Those fears are grounded in real-world consequences. The fear of hell is built on the thought of something no one has ever seen, but is said to last forever. That makes it uniquely destructive, because the mind cannot process eternity, and yet is forced to try. Preaching about hellfire does not work by giving people reason. It works by bypassing reason and embedding terror. Children are often the first targets. At an age when they cannot question authority, they are told that even a stray thought or a natural curiosity could earn them unimaginable pain after death. Studies in psychology have shown that fear-based conditioning during childhood can alter brain development. The amygdala, which processes fear, becomes more reactive when exposed to constant threats. In this sense, sermons about eternal torment can shape the wiring of the brain itself, making people more prone to anxiety and guilt even outside religious contexts. This is why so many adults who grew up under fire and brimstone preaching speak of nightmares that haunted them for years. They describe lying awake at night, terrified that their minor failings might send them into a pit of flames. It is striking that something which has never been proven to exist can cause the same psychological effects as a real trauma. That is because the brain does not always distinguish between real and imagined threats. If the belief is strong enough, the stress response is the same as if the danger were present. The lasting effect is not just fear of punishment. It creates a cycle of self-surveillance. People are taught to monitor every thought, every desire, and every doubt. Modern psychology calls this thought suppression, and research shows it often has the opposite effect. When you try not to think of something, you end up thinking of it more. So a child told never to doubt or never to question ends up obsessing over the very things they are forbidden to consider. This leads to guilt, shame, and a sense of being broken. The fear of hellfire, then, does not only frighten people about the future, it convinces them they are already condemned in the present. In a more subtle way, hellfire preaching creates dependence on religious authority. If people are told that their eternal fate hangs on every mistake, they need constant reassurance. The preacher or priest becomes the only one who can explain the path out of danger. This builds a hierarchy where fear is the currency of control. It is not different in structure from an abusive relationship, where threats of harm keep the victim dependent. In this case, the harm is said to come after death, but the psychological grip is just as strong. When researchers study the mental health of those raised under heavy fear-based preaching, they often find high rates of anxiety disorders, depression, and even symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress. Some therapists now specialize in what they call religious trauma syndrome. They describe patients who tremble at the thought of reading certain verses, or who panic when they hear preaching about judgment. These are not mild effects. They are deep scars left by years of mental conditioning. One might think that adults can simply let go of such beliefs when they no longer make sense. But the psychology of fear is not that simple. Once the mind has been trained to connect doubt or disobedience with the threat of eternal punishment, the response becomes automatic. Even if reason tells someone there is no evidence for hell, the body still reacts with fear. The heart races, the stomach turns, the nightmares return. Fear is far more persistent than belief. That is why many people say they no longer believe, but still feel the terror creeping back in moments of weakness. Another overlooked impact is how this type of preaching affects moral development. Fear-based morality teaches people not to do wrong because of punishment, not because of empathy or understanding. Developmental psychology shows that the healthiest moral reasoning comes from recognizing the value of others, not from being threatened with pain. When morality is tied to hellfire, it never grows beyond obedience. Adults raised this way often struggle to make ethical choices when authority is not watching. They are conditioned to fear consequences, not to value compassion. The doctrine of hell also distorts natural emotions. Take curiosity, for example. Curiosity is one of the most important drivers of human progress. Yet when children are told that questioning could lead them to damnation, curiosity becomes a danger. The same is true of joy. If too much laughter, pleasure, or desire is condemned, those natural emotions become sources of guilt. Over time, this creates a split between what people feel and what they are told they should feel. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, and it is a major cause of stress and inner conflict. Instead of living with authenticity, people live in constant self-contradiction. The message of hellfire also reshapes family life. Parents who believe in eternal punishment often use fear as a tool of discipline. A child who misbehaves may not only be punished physically, but also threatened with fire after death. This intensifies the punishment beyond the moment, embedding fear into the child's long-term memory. Studies on intergenerational trauma show that children who are raised in environments of constant threat often pass down patterns of anxiety and fear to their own children. Thus, the preaching of hell can echo across generations, leaving psychological marks even on those who later abandon the belief. There is also the social dimension. In communities where hellfire is constantly preached, people police each other's behavior. Gossip, shame, and public condemnation become tools to keep everyone in line. The fear of being labeled a sinner is not only about avoiding punishment after death, but also about avoiding ostracism in life. Social psychologists have long noted that humans are deeply afraid of exclusion. By tying eternal consequences to community judgment, religions maximize the pressure. The result is conformity, not conviction. Perhaps one of the most damaging effects is how the fear of hellfire undermines mental resilience. Resilience is the ability to recover from setbacks, to see failure as temporary and growth as possible. But when every mistake is framed as proof of damnation, failure becomes crushing. Instead of learning from errors, people spiral into despair. This is particularly destructive for teenagers and young adults who are at a stage where exploration and mistakes are part of growth. To tell them that a single wrong step could lead to endless fire is to strip away the natural process of learning. The irony is that many preachers present hellfire sermons as messages of love. They argue that warning people of danger is an act of care. Yet psychological studies on fear-based persuasion show that extreme threats rarely produce long-term positive behavior. Instead, they produce avoidance, denial, or obsessive anxiety. A child may obey under fear, but the obedience is fragile and shallow. Once the external threat is removed, the structure collapses. This explains why so many people raised under fire and brimstone preaching eventually reject it, though often after years of inner turmoil. At a broader level, the belief in eternal punishment creates a worldview where suffering is normalized. If endless torture can be considered just, then earthly suffering loses its meaning too. Victims of poverty, war, or disease can be dismissed with the thought that worse awaits in the afterlife for those who deserve it. This erodes empathy. Instead of working to reduce harm in the world, people are taught to accept it as part of a cosmic system of reward and punishment. The psychological effect is detachment, a dulling of compassion. Yet perhaps the most insidious effect of hellfire preaching is its ability to shape identity. When someone grows up hearing that they are naturally sinful, weak, and deserving of punishment, This belief seeps into their self-image. Even when they achieve success, the inner voice whispers that they are unworthy. This kind of shame-based identity is one of the hardest to overcome. It is not a belief about the world, but about the self. And because it is linked to the threat of eternal fire, it feels absolute. Therapy can help, but it often takes years to untangle the knots tied in childhood by such teaching. The human brain is highly adaptive, but it is also vulnerable. What we are told repeatedly, especially in youth, becomes part of how we see reality. Hellfire preaching exploits this vulnerability. It does not present evidence or reasoned arguments. It floods the mind with images of terror until the fear becomes second nature. And because the threat is said to last forever, there is never relief. Unlike earthly fears, which end when the danger passes, the fear of hell has no end point. This makes it one of the most corrosive psychological forces ever used in human culture. The psychological power of Hellfire teaching lies not just in its threat, but in its vagueness. Unlike concrete punishments, which have a clear beginning and end, eternal torment is undefined. There are no boundaries, no timeline, no sense of eventual relief. This makes the fear endless. Psychologists studying trauma note that uncertainty magnifies anxiety. A person who does not know when a threat will strike or how long it will last is far more distressed than someone facing a defined hardship. The doctrine of hell takes this uncertainty to its absolute extreme. Punishment that never ends, for reasons that are often unclear, decided by criteria that shift depending on which preacher is speaking. This uncertainty explains why even devout believers often confess they never feel secure. No matter how much they pray, confess, or obey, the fear lingers. They wonder if they have misunderstood, if they have committed a hidden sin, if their repentance was sincere enough. Instead of providing peace, Hellfire preaching locks people into permanent insecurity. The human nervous system is not designed to live under constant threat. Stress hormones like cortisol are meant for short bursts, not for lifelong exposure. When the stress never ends, it weakens the body, impairs memory, damages sleep, and contributes to physical illness. In this way, the doctrine of eternal fire does not only harm the mind, it also harms the body. Some preachers openly admit that Hellfire sermons are used to keep people loyal. They argue that fear is the beginning of wisdom. But research and education shows that fear rarely creates genuine understanding. Students who are motivated by fear of failure may memorize material, but they rarely develop curiosity or creativity. In the same way, believers who obey out of terror may conform outwardly, but their inner lives are filled with conflict. They learn to wear masks, to pretend assurance while hiding doubt. The psychological cost of this performance is heavy, as it divides the self into public and private, authentic and artificial. The fear of hell also warps relationships between parents and children. Parents who believe in eternal punishment often feel obligated to instill the same fear in their children, thinking they are saving them. But this replaces trust with terror. Instead of seeing their parents as protectors, children see them as enforcers of invisible threats. Developmental psychologists note that children raised in environments of conditional love, where affection depends on obedience, often grow into adults who struggle with intimacy and self-worth. Hellfire teaching intensifies this conditionality, tying acceptance not only to behavior in this life, but to imagined outcomes after death. Another striking impact is how the threat of eternal torment discourages critical thinking. Human beings are naturally curious and skeptical. But when the cost of questioning is framed as everlasting pain, curiosity is crushed. This has long-term effects on cognitive development. A child who learns that doubt equals danger often suppresses their analytical abilities. They avoid asking difficult questions, not only about religion, but about life in general. Over time, this produces a kind of intellectual paralysis. Even when they later leave the belief, they may find it difficult to fully trust their reasoning abilities because doubt still feels dangerous on a subconscious level. The connection between hellfire preaching and obsessive-compulsive tendencies has also been observed. Obsessive-compulsive disorder often involves intrusive thoughts and compulsions to neutralize them. In a religious context, fear of hell can drive endless cycles of confession, prayer, or ritual, aimed at warding off punishment. This is sometimes called scrupulosity. People trapped in this pattern describe spending hours checking if their prayers were said correctly, if their thoughts were pure enough, if they have covered every possible sin. Far from bringing freedom, religion in this form becomes an endless prison of the mind. Hellfire preaching also intensifies tribal boundaries. If one group believes that only their doctrine protects from eternal fire, then outsiders are seen not just as different, but as doomed. This creates a psychological distance that weakens empathy. Sociologists have observed that groups with strong doctrines of eternal punishment are often more hostile to outsiders because they see them as enemies of salvation. This hostility can easily spill into violence, as history shows. But even without violence, it produces communities where compassion is limited to those who share the same fear, while others are dehumanized as beyond saving. The fear of hell also interacts with natural existential anxiety. Human beings already wrestle with the fact of mortality. The thought of death is unsettling, but psychology shows that people cope by finding meaning in relationships, work, and creativity. Hellfire preaching takes this natural anxiety and multiplies it. Instead of death being the end of suffering, it is framed as the beginning of unending agony for most of humanity. This makes death not just frightening, but unbearable. The normal process of accepting mortality is interrupted, leaving people in a state of permanent dread about the inevitable. There is also the problem of how hellfire preaching frames justice. When people are taught that eternal torment is a fair punishment for temporary failings, their sense of proportion is distorted. Justice in human societies is built on balance. The punishment should fit the crime. But if endless fire is seen as just, then earthly punishments can easily become harsh as well. This is why many communities influenced by fire and brimstone theology endorse severe penalties for minor offenses. The psychological normalization of extreme punishment spills into social life, shaping laws and attitudes toward others. For those who later reject hellfire preaching, the recovery process is long. Many describe it as similar to recovering from an abusive relationship. They have to learn to trust their own thoughts, to rebuild self-worth, and to manage anxiety that surfaces at unexpected times. Therapists working with such individuals often stress the importance of understanding trauma responses. The shaking hands, racing heart, and recurring nightmares are not signs of weakness, but symptoms of years of indoctrinated fear. Recovery requires unlearning the reflexive association between doubt and danger, a process that can take years. It is also worth noting that hellfire preaching has economic and political consequences. Fear makes people easier to control. When citizens believe that questioning leaders or resisting authority might imperil their souls, they are less likely to challenge injustice. This is why regimes throughout history have supported fire and brimstone religion. It serves as a psychological police force, punishing dissent not just in this world, but with the threat of eternal fire in the next. The fear becomes a tool of social stability, but at the cost of human freedom and mental health. A particularly harmful effect is how the doctrine of hell warps the concept of love. People are told that God loves them, yet at the same time that he might burn them forever. This contradiction creates what psychologists call trauma bonding, where fear and affection are intertwined. Victims of abusive relationships often experience the same confusion. The person who harms them also claims to love them. This confuses the brain's reward and punishment systems, making it hard to distinguish between genuine care and control. In religious contexts, this trauma bond keeps people loyal, even as they suffer emotionally. The legacy of Hellfire preaching is visible in the lives of countless former believers. Many report difficulty forming healthy relationships because their early models of love were tied to fear. Others struggle with decision-making, haunted by the idea that every choice carries eternal consequences. Some wrestle with ongoing guilt over natural human desires, unable to shake the feeling of being sinful at the core. These are not trivial issues. They are lifelong struggles rooted in childhood indoctrination, passed down through sermons meant to frighten rather than enlighten. The persistence of this preaching style, despite its harms, shows how powerful fear can be as a motivator. Religious institutions know that nothing grips the human mind like terror. Promises of reward may attract, but threats of fire bind. The tragedy is that this binding comes at the cost of psychological well-being. Fear-driven religion claims to save souls, but in practice it damages minds, stunts growth, and weakens resilience. Even in societies where belief in hell has declined, the echoes remain. People who no longer attend church often describe sudden moments of panic, as though a voice from the past whispers that they are doomed. This is evidence of how deeply the doctrine embeds itself. It is not simply a belief that can be discarded at will. It is a pattern of fear imprinted in the nervous system. Overcoming it requires conscious effort, community support, and often professional help. The human mind is capable of great strength, but it is also fragile when shaped by fear during development. Hellfire preaching takes advantage of that fragility. It hijacks imagination, poisons curiosity, and corrupts moral reasoning. It leaves people with scars that outlast the belief itself. In this way, it is one of the most harmful psychological inventions ever created, not because it describes a real danger, but because it creates danger where none exists, in the very mind of the believer. One of the most overlooked aspects of Hellfire preaching is how it teaches people to distrust their own conscience. A healthy conscience is built through empathy and social learning. We feel guilt because we understand how our actions affect others. But when sermons declare that sins are defined not by harm, but by disobedience, conscience becomes warped. A person may feel guilty for private thoughts that harm no one, while feeling no guilt for cruelty toward outsiders, because cruelty is endorsed by the system. The natural moral compass is overridden, replaced with fear of invisible rules. Over time, people begin to doubt their own instincts, relying entirely on authority to tell them what is right and wrong. This dependency keeps them trapped. There is a striking paradox here. The very preaching that claims to bring freedom from sin instead creates psychological slavery. When every thought is monitored, when every doubt is dangerous, the result is not freedom, but surveillance. Modern psychology shows that constant surveillance, whether from governments, institutions, or parents, creates anxiety and conformity. Hellfire adds another layer, convincing people that surveillance is not only external, but internal, with every thought weighed by an omniscient judge. This is perhaps the most invasive control imaginable, one that extends beyond human institutions into the very private world of the mind. The long-term effects are visible in patterns of mental illness. Studies on highly religious populations with strong beliefs in hell consistently show higher levels of anxiety and depression. A survey from the Pew Research Center found that people who strongly believe in eternal punishment report lower levels of life satisfaction compared to those who do not. This is not surprising. Fear corrodes well-being. When life is framed not as a chance for growth, but as a test with eternal stakes, the weight becomes unbearable. Even joy is shadowed by fear, because joy might be seen as sinful indulgence. This constant self-monitoring also damages creativity. Creativity requires openness, experimentation, and tolerance for failure. But in a world where failure equals damnation, creativity is suffocated. Many ex-believers describe how they suppressed artistic expression, music, or writing, fearing it might lead them into temptation. Entire generations of potential thinkers, artists, and innovators have been silenced under the shadow of eternal fire. The psychological impact is not only personal, but cultural, robbing societies of voices that might have contributed beauty and insight. The teaching of hell also reshapes how people deal with mental health struggles. Depression, anxiety, or intrusive thoughts are often reframed as spiritual failures. Instead of seeking therapy or treatment, individuals are told to pray harder or repent more sincerely. This deepens the suffering, as people blame themselves for conditions that are biological or psychological in origin. Some even come to believe that their mental illness is a sign of damnation, a foretaste of the punishment to come. This compounds pain with hopelessness, leaving them trapped in cycles of despair. Hellfire preaching also affects how people view others. If one believes that the majority of humanity is destined for eternal flames, it creates a world divided into the saved and the damned. This fosters an us versus them mentality that has devastating social consequences. Compassion for outsiders diminishes, replaced with pity at best, hostility at worst. The psychological mechanism here is dehumanization. When others are seen as eternally condemned, their suffering in this life matters less. This mindset has justified countless acts of cruelty throughout history, from wars to persecutions, all rationalized by the thought that the victims were already bound for worse torment anyway. Even the imagery of hell itself has psychological power. Vivid descriptions of fire, worms, darkness, and torment stick in the imagination. Neuroscientists know that the brain processes vivid images almost as if they were real experiences. When a preacher paints a picture of eternal flames, the mind rehearses fear as though it were encountering the danger directly. For children especially, whose ability to distinguish metaphor from reality is limited, these images become seared into memory. Many adults who left religion decades ago still recall those terrifying sermons with clarity, as if they had happened yesterday. The imprint is that deep. The cycle of fear also intersects with sexuality in harmful ways. Natural sexual development during adolescence becomes a battlefield. Desires are labeled sinful, leading to obsessive guilt. Every impulse is scrutinized, every attraction feared. This often results in repression, secrecy, and distorted relationships later in life. Psychologists working with former believers frequently report that fear of hell left them unable to experience intimacy without shame. Some describe physical intimacy as inseparable from terror, because their earliest experiences of desire were tied to threats of fire. This shows how deeply fear can corrupt even the most basic human experiences. The threat of eternal punishment also fosters authoritarian personalities. When people are trained to obey out of fear, they become more likely to submit to leaders who demand loyalty. Studies have shown a correlation between belief in hell and political authoritarianism. The mechanism is simple. If unquestioning obedience is necessary to escape eternal fire, then unquestioning obedience to earthly authorities feels natural. This has profound social consequences, as populations shaped by hellfire teaching may become less resistant to tyranny, seeing it as part of divine order. Another consequence is how fear of hell impacts decision-making. Instead of weighing choices rationally, people make decisions based on what they think will protect them from damnation. This can lead to life paths chosen not out of passion or purpose, but out of fear. People may avoid careers, relationships, or opportunities because they were told these might endanger their souls. The regret often surfaces later in life when they realize how much was lost to fear of a punishment that never existed outside their imagination. Even forgiveness is distorted by Hellfire preaching. True forgiveness is about letting go, about healing and moving forward. But when forgiveness is framed as the only escape from fire, it becomes transactional. People are pressured to forgive abusers, oppressors, or harmful institutions, not out of genuine healing, but out of fear of punishment if they do not. This manipulates victims into silence, leaving injustice unchallenged. The psychological toll is enormous, as victims are denied the right to process anger and grief in healthy ways. The idea of eternal fire also undermines human dignity. To declare that a person deserves endless torture for finite mistakes is to strip them of inherent worth. Even if believers claim that salvation restores dignity, the underlying message is that without obedience, one is worthless. This conditional dignity leaves deep scars. Former believers often describe feelings of worthlessness that linger long after they reject the doctrine. They struggle to believe they deserve happiness because they were told for so long that they deserved flames. The persistence of Hellfire preaching, despite its obvious harms, shows how power operates through fear. It is not sustained because it heals or uplifts, but because it binds. Fear is addictive for those who wield it. Preachers who thunder about fire see their congregations shaken, crying, desperate for reassurance. That desperation translates into loyalty, donations, and obedience. The psychological cost to the individuals does not matter in this calculation. What matters is control. In this way, Hellfire preaching reveals itself not as a path to truth, but as a system of manipulation. Yet, despite its power, there is hope in the fact that people do recover. Many who grew up under these teachings eventually learn to rebuild their lives. They discover that morality can be grounded in empathy, not fear. They learn that curiosity is not dangerous, but beautiful. They begin to reclaim their dignity, to separate love from terror, to heal from shame. The process is difficult, but the very existence of recovery shows the resilience of the human mind. Fear may scar, but it does not erase the capacity for growth. The legacy of Hellfire preaching is long and heavy. It has shaped cultures, stunted lives, and haunted countless nights of restless sleep. Its psychological impact is not limited to the past, but continues in the present. In every child who trembles at a sermon. In every adult who wakes sweating from a nightmare about flames. To understand this impact is to recognize how profoundly fear can be used as a tool of control. It is also to recognize how urgently people need spaces free of such terror. Spaces where curiosity, compassion, and dignity can thrive without the shadow of eternal fire hanging over them.